I was 21 when I visited there, the kind of age when you think you're invincible, when curiosity outweighs fear, and when road trips to forgotten places feel like an adventure instead of a mistake. And that's how I ended up driving into Hollow Creek, a city in the Midwest that had been abandoned for more than 3 decades after a chemical plant explosion poisoned the air. Or at least that's what the official story said. Though the people who lived in nearby towns told it differently, whispering about disappearances, screams heard on windless nights, and lights that flickered in buildings long after the last power lines were cut. And I didn't go there because I was brave, but because I was restless, because I dropped out of college the year before and had been drifting, working at a gas station, saving a little money, and looking for something, anything, that would make me feel alive again. I'd heard about Hollow Creek from a podcast, a late-night horror show where 2 hosts joked about ghosts, but their laughter couldn't quite hide their unease as they described shadowy figures in the windows of schools, piles of children's shoes left in alleys, and a church bell that rang at midnight even though the steeple had collapsed decades ago. And for some reason I couldn't let it go, so I mapped out the drive, filled my tank, grabbed a flashlight and my phone, and told myself it was just another forgotten ghost town that would make for a cool story. The drive itself was uneventful, long stretches of highway giving way to cracked county roads, until the trees grew taller and denser and the GPS froze on a blank screen, as if it had given up on guiding me any further. And that was when I saw the sign, rusted and leaning, with faded letters that once read, "Welcome to Hollow Creek, a place to call home." And the irony of it struck me so hard that I laughed out loud in the empty car, though the sound died quickly, swallowed by the stillness around me. When I rolled into the city limits, the first thing I noticed was the silence, not the peaceful kind but the heavy kind, like a held breath, and the streets were lined with skeletal trees and houses sagging inward as though tired of standing, their windows blank eyes staring at me. I parked near what had once been the town square, a cracked fountain at its center choked with weeds, and stepped out, the air strangely cold for late summer, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. At first it was just decay, peeling paint, broken glass, collapsed roofs, but then I noticed the details that shouldn't have been there. Children's toys scattered across a porch as if dropped mid-play, a swing still swaying gently even though there was no wind, and a single light flickering in the second story of an old library that had no power for decades. My stomach tightened, but I pushed forward, telling myself it was all explainable. Animals, the breeze, maybe squatters. Yet when I walked down Main Street, every storefront seemed frozen in time, mannequins dressed in 70s clothes staring blankly from behind cracked glass, and in one shop, a calendar still hung on the wall, the page forever stuck on October 1982, the month of the supposed explosion. I decided to document everything, pulling out my phone to record video, narrating nervously. "This is Hollow Creek. It's supposed to be dead, but it doesn't feel dead." And that's when I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps echoing down the street behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, but the street was empty, the cracked pavement stretching back toward the sign, no one there, yet the sound continued, slow, deliberate, crunching on gravel, and when I shone the light toward the old post office, I swore I saw the shape of a man just beyond the doorway, watching me. My heart pounded as I whispered to myself, "It's just shadows, just your imagination." But when I blinked, the doorway was empty, though the air still carried the faint scent of smoke, like burnt wood and something sweeter, rotting. I pressed on, passing boarded houses and a collapsed diner, until I reached the church at the end of Main, its steeple broken but its heavy doors still intact, and though I told myself I wouldn't go in, I found my hand pushing one open, the hinges groaning, and inside the pews were covered in dust but arranged neatly, as if waiting for a congregation that would never return, and at the altar, a Bible lay open, its pages yellowed but not torn, and my flashlight beam caught something written in the margins in jagged letters. "Do not let them see you." My throat went dry, and before I could process it, the church bell rang above me, impossibly loud, reverberating through the hollow city, and I stumbled back, clutching my ears, even though the steeple was broken and the bell was supposed to be gone. When the sound faded, I heard something else, faint but distinct, the sound of children laughing somewhere in the distance, high-pitched giggles that grew louder, echoing through the streets of a city that was supposed to be empty. And in that moment, standing in the ruins of Hollow Creek, I realized the stories hadn't been exaggerated, they hadn't even scratched the surface, and that I had walked into something I wasn't meant to see. I stumbled out of the church, my legs shaking, the faint sound of children's laughter still dancing through the empty streets, and for a moment I thought about running back to my car, turning the key, and never looking back. But something about Hollow Creek pulled me deeper, like the city itself had hooked its claws into me, whispering that if I left now I would never know the truth, and though fear gnawed at me, curiosity pushed harder. So I tightened my grip on the flashlight and forced myself down another street, one lined with houses that leaned into each other like drunks, their porches rotted, doors ajar as though inviting me in. The air grew colder, and as I walked, I noticed frost forming on the edges of broken windows even though it was late summer, and with every step the silence seemed to thicken, broken only by the crunch of my boots and, every so often, the faint echo of something walking just out of sync with me. I told myself it was my imagination until I stopped suddenly and heard one more step echo behind me, delayed, deliberate, like someone, or something, wanted me to know I wasn't alone. I whipped the flashlight around, its beam catching only peeling paint and weeds pushing through cracked pavement, but in the distance, at the corner where the street bent, a shadow pulled back, moving faster than any human could, vanishing behind a building. My throat went dry, but I pressed forward, drawn toward the library whose flickering light I had seen earlier, and when I reached it, the double doors hung loose, one barely attached, creaking with every push of the wind, and as I stepped inside, the air smelled of mildew and something metallic, like blood, and rows of shelves stretched into the dark, books swollen with mold, pages torn and scattered across the floor as though a storm had passed through. But what made me stop cold was the lamp on a desk in the center of the room, glowing faintly with a yellow light, even though the city had been cut off from power for decades. And next to it lay a notebook, its cover warped by age but its pages filled with frantic handwriting, notes scrawled by someone who had lived here long after the evacuation. The entries spoke of voices in the walls, and eyes in the glass, and one line that made my skin crawl. The city is not empty. It remembers, and it wants us back. As I flipped through the notebook, a sudden crash echoed from upstairs, and my flashlight flickered violently, plunging me into half-darkness before sputtering back on, and in that moment of black I thought I saw dozens of pale hands pressed against the windows, smearing frost on the glass, gone when the light returned. Heart racing, I forced myself toward the stairs, each step groaning, the air thick with dust, and as I reached the landing, I heard whispering, not one voice but many, overlapping, too faint to understand, circling me like a swarm. At the end of the hall, one door stood slightly open, a faint light leaking through, and though my instincts screamed to turn back, I pushed it open and froze. The room was empty except for a chair in the center, facing the wall, and on the wall were dozens of photographs pinned in neat rows, all black and white, all of people standing on these same streets decades ago, smiling, unaware. But as I looked closer my stomach dropped. Because in the background of each photo, almost hidden, was the same tall, shadowy figure, its face blurred, its body half turned toward the camera as if it had been watching them. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the chair, and the whispers grew louder, rising into a chorus until the light bulb above me burst, showering me in glass and plunging the room into darkness. I bolted down the stairs, through the library doors, and into the street, gasping in the cold night air, and that's when I realized the sun had set far faster than it should have, as if the city had swallowed time, because it was only late afternoon when I entered, but now the sky was pitch black, the moon hanging low and sickly yellow, and the shadows between the buildings seemed thicker, almost alive, twisting with every flick of my flashlight. I tried to make my way back toward the square where my car was parked, but the streets had changed. Alleys I hadn't noticed before cut across the blocks, buildings seemed closer together, and no matter how many turns I took, the fountain in the square never appeared, as if Hollow Creek was rearranging itself around me, refusing to let me go. I shouted into the night, my own voice bouncing back distorted, and that's when I saw movement ahead, a group of children skipping across the street, holding hands, their faces pale in the moonlight, and though they moved like children, their heads turned toward me all at once, their eyes black voids, and I froze, heart hammering, until they vanished into the dark like smoke. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment I was plunged into blackness, and in that instant I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of someone breathing against the back of my neck, warm and wet, and when the light returned, there was no one there, only a message scratched into the pavement at my feet, letters jagged as if carved with nails. "You came back." My stomach lurched, because I had never been here before, at least not in this life, but the city seemed to think otherwise, and as the air thickened, the whispers grew clearer, words forming. "Stay, belong, forever." And I realized Hollow Creek wasn't abandoned, it was waiting, and it had chosen me. I tried to steady my breathing, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but the more I fought to calm down, the heavier the air became, like the city itself was leaning closer to listen, feeding on my fear, and I knew if I didn't find some place to hide soon I'd collapse right there in the street. So I ducked into the nearest building, an old diner with shattered glass doors and a neon sign that still buzzed faintly with a sick red glow even though there hadn't been electricity here for decades. And as I stepped inside, the stench of grease and rot hit me, menus still open on tables as if the last customers had walked out mid-meal, their plates covered in dust, forks half-raised in frozen gestures of forgotten life. I shined the light across the counter and nearly dropped it when I saw someone standing there, a waitress in a faded uniform, her head tilted unnaturally, eyes wide and glassy as though she'd been dead for years, yet she moved, twitching, one hand reaching for a coffee pot that wasn't there, pouring invisible liquid into an empty cup, then looking up at me with a cracked smile that split her cheek like torn fabric. And before I could scream, she flickered out like static, leaving nothing but the sound of dishes rattling in the kitchen. My gut screamed to run, but I forced myself forward, drawn toward the jukebox in the corner that suddenly flickered to life, a record spinning though no one had touched it, and a faint song began to play, warped and slow, a woman's voice singing something I couldn't understand but felt in my bones, and as the music played, shadows slid across the walls, dozens of figures gathering, faceless patrons sitting at the tables, their hands moving, mouths opening in silent laughter, all watching me. Without eyes. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, and the moment the chair hit the floor, all of them vanished at once, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence. But when I turned toward the door, it was no longer there, the wall had closed over it, leaving me trapped. Panic clawed through me, my chest tightening, and in that moment I noticed something scratched into the counter where the waitress had stood, words etched deep as if by desperate hands. "They don't let you leave!" I felt something move behind me, the air heavy with breath, and I spun around just as the kitchen door creaked open, revealing only darkness. But out of that black came footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging as though someone's feet were heavy with chains, and I pointed the flashlight, its beam shaking, catching the glint of something metallic dragging across the floor, and then the outline of a man appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, a butcher's apron hanging from him, drenched in stains too dark to be old grease, and in his hand a massive cleaver that scraped against the tiles with each step. His face was shadowed, but when he lifted his head, I saw eyes hollow and glowing faintly red, locking onto me with a hunger that froze me where I stood. I bolted toward the back, slamming through the swinging door into the kitchen, pots and pans clattering as I shoved past, the air thick with the smell of rotting meat, and the sound of his footsteps quickened, chains dragging louder as he gave chase. My flashlight flickered again, plunging me into momentary darkness, and in that half-second I felt his presence inches behind me, the heat of his breath burning the back of my neck, and I screamed, crashing through another door that burst open into the alley. I ran until my legs nearly gave out, stumbling over broken pavement, lungs burning, but when I dared to glance back, the alley stretched impossibly long, the diner nowhere to be seen, and the butcher gone as though he never existed, leaving me gasping in eerie silence. But that silence didn't last long. The whispers returned, louder, more insistent, circling me from every direction, and as I stumbled into what looked like the town square at last, my knees buckled at the sight before me. The fountain was there, but it was no longer dry, Thick black water bubbled up, glowing faintly under the moonlight, and around the fountain dozens of figures stood in a perfect circle, men, women, children, all dressed in clothes from different eras, their eyes dark voids, their mouths moving in unison as they chanted words I couldn't understand. The air pulsed with energy, the ground vibrating beneath my feet, and I realized with horror they weren't looking at the fountain. They were looking at me. Their heads turned in perfect synchronization, their chanting rising into a shriek that pierced my skull, and the fountain erupted, spraying black water that splashed across my skin, burning like acid, and I collapsed, screaming, as images flooded my mind, visions of this city decades ago, of fires, of people chained in basements, of doctors in white coats experimenting on screaming patients, of rituals performed beneath the church, of children offered as sacrifices to something vast and unseen. And then, through the blur, I saw it, the shadow figure from the photographs, towering, faceless, standing at the heart of it all, feeding on the terror, binding the city with invisible threads of power, and the voice that filled my head was not the whispers of the dead but something older, deeper, promising that once you stepped into Hollow Creek, you belonged to it forever. I woke with a start, lying on the cold stone by the fountain, the square empty again, my body shaking, the burns on my arms already healing into blackened scars that pulsed faintly with each heartbeat, and I realized I hadn't escaped. I had been marked. I staggered to my feet, every muscle trembling as if my body no longer belonged to me, the black scars on my arms throbbing in rhythm with some hidden pulse beneath the ground. And though the square looked empty, I couldn't shake the feeling that dozens of eyes still watched me from the shadows, waiting, measuring, deciding when to close in. And I knew if I stayed there one more second I'd collapse again, so I stumbled away down another street. The air colder now, the silence thicker, until I reached what looked like the city library, its grand stone facade cracked and vine-choked but still standing tall like a monument to forgotten knowledge. Something inside me urged me toward it, maybe instinct, maybe the same force that had marked me, but I pushed through the heavy doors and stepped into the dust-choked dark, the smell of old paper and mildew wrapping around me. My flashlight beams swept across endless shelves, many toppled, books scattered across the floor, their pages yellowed and brittle, but as I moved deeper I realized the books weren't random. They were open, laid out in a pattern, each one filled with handwritten notes, not in English but in some twisted script that seemed to squirm when I stared too long, and my stomach knotted as I realized they weren't just books, they were records. Accounts of the city, every name, every birth, every death. Every disappearance catalogued as though someone or something had been keeping track long after the town had been abandoned. I followed the trail of open books to a table in the center of the library where a massive tome lay waiting, its cover bound in something that looked too much like skin, and though every nerve screamed not to touch it, I couldn't resist. I brushed away the dust and opened it. The pages were filled with drawings, not words, drawings of the same shadow figure I'd seen in my vision, looming over houses, over churches, over people kneeling with chains around their necks, their eyes black voids. And on the final page, my blood turned to ice, because the drawing wasn't of the past, it was of me, standing at the fountain, the scars glowing on my arms, the shadow behind me with one hand resting on my shoulder as if claiming me. My breath caught and I dropped the book, but it didn't fall, it slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing like a gunshot, and suddenly the library groaned around me, shelves shaking, books flying from them as though hurled by invisible hands, the air filled with screams not from any throat but from the walls themselves. I bolted toward the exit, but when I reached the door, it wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I shoved, and then from the second-floor balcony I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, and I looked up to see figures standing there, dozens of them, men in long black coats and wide-brimmed hats, their faces hidden, all watching me. One raised his arm and pointed, and immediately the books on the floor began to twist, the paper slithering like snakes, wrapping around my legs, pulling me down, the words from the pages burning into my skin as if branding me with every name, every curse, every dark act committed in this place. I screamed, ripping the pages away, and in desperation I hurled my flashlight at the stained glass window, the crash shattering the silence, letting in a sliver of moonlight, and in that moment the pull on my body loosened just enough for me to break free, clawing at the door until it finally burst open and I stumbled back into the freezing night air. I collapsed on the steps, gasping, the sound of whispers spilling from the library behind me, dozens of voices rising and falling in unholy unison, and though I ran again, this time I felt different, heavier, like something from the library had followed me out. As I staggered through the streets, I began noticing things I hadn't before: faint lights in windows, children's laughter echoing through alleys, figures standing at intersections who disappeared when I drew closer, and the realization struck me like a hammer. This city wasn't abandoned at all, not in the way people thought. It was alive, trapped between life and death, its citizens caught in endless loops of horror, reenacting their pain again and again. And now, because I had entered, because I had touched the book, I was becoming one of them. My chest tightened with despair, but some stubborn fire inside me refused to give up, and I swore I wouldn't let this city consume me without learning the truth, without finding out why Hollow Creek had been damned in the first place. And as I rounded another corner, I saw it, the old church, its steeple crooked, its doors hanging open like a mouth inviting me in, and deep down I knew the answers waited inside, but so did the shadow, and if I entered, there might be no coming back. I stood at the threshold of the church, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but something stronger pulled me in, a sick gravity dragging my feet forward as if the city itself demanded I step inside, and the moment I crossed the threshold the air changed, heavy with the scent of burned incense and rot, and though the pews were long collapsed, the altar crumbled, the stained glass shattered, I could feel the presence of something vast, ancient, and watching, the shadows shifting against the walls as if breathing. My steps echoed far too loud for an empty space, and when I reached what remained of the altar I saw candles, fresh, still burning, arranged in a circle around an old ledger not unlike the one in the library, but this time the names written in it weren't the townspeople. They were strangers, outsiders, travelers, and as my eyes scanned the pages I froze because I recognized the last entry, my own name, my handwriting, as though I had already signed it without knowing, sealing some pact I didn't remember making. My body went cold, my breath fogging in the stale air, and then I felt it, the hand on my shoulder, the same as in the vision, cold and heavy and impossibly real. I didn't turn, I couldn't. The voice that spoke wasn't a voice at all but a vibration inside my skull, a whisper that said, "You were always meant to be here." I stumbled back, knocking over one of the candles, the flame snuffing out instantly, and when I dared glance behind me, there was nothing, just the flickering shadows stretching longer, darker, swallowing the walls until the church was gone and I was standing once more in the middle of the city square, the fountain bubbling black beneath the moonlight, every building alive with whispers, every window filled with hollow-eyed faces staring down at me. I screamed, but the sound was devoured by the air, leaving me mute, and I ran until my legs gave out, until the horizon burned with dawn, and when I finally looked back, the city was gone, nothing but trees and empty fields where moments ago an entire cursed town had stood. To this day I don't know if I escaped, or if I've been trapped ever since, wandering in some illusion that only lets me think I got away. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is too quiet, I hear the fountain bubbling, I feel the scarred skin on my arms burn, and I see lights flicker in the corners of my room as if Hollow Creek is still there, waiting, calling me back. Maybe it never let me go. Maybe I never left. I was 22 when I first heard about the asylum, a crumbling fortress of brick and steel hidden deep in the woods just outside the small Midwestern town where I grew up, and though most people pretended not to know it existed, everyone whispered about it. Especially the older kids in high school who loved to scare us with tales of missing hikers, screams echoing on moonless nights, and lights burning in windows long since boarded up. The place had closed decades ago after some scandal no one would talk about, but the ruins still stood, fenced off with rusted chain link and weathered signs that warned keep out in fading paint, and for years it had gnawed at my curiosity. I was always the sort of person who wanted to see behind the locked door, to pull back the curtain everyone else avoided, and that urge only grew stronger when I left for college and heard even darker rumors. Patients experimented on, doctors who went insane, and something about the asylum's basement that no one dared describe in detail. That summer, Restless and back home with nothing but a part-time job to fill the long days, I decided I was done listening to second-hand stories. I needed to see it for myself, not with a group of laughing friends on a dare but alone, really alone, to know the truth. I told no one where I was going that evening. I just packed a flashlight, a small backpack with water and snacks, and drove my beat-up car down the winding backroads until the trees swallowed the sky and the air grew damp and heavy, like the forest itself was warning me to turn back. I parked by a dirt trail, cut the engine, and sat there for a minute listening to the ticking of the cooling motor and the hush of cicadas before I grabbed my bag and stepped into the woods. The walk was longer than I expected, nearly a mile of weaving through thick undergrowth, but soon I saw the top of the asylum rise above the tree-line, a hulking silhouette against the fading dusk. Its windows like dead eyes watching me. By the time I reached the fence, night had settled in, the air sharp and cool, and I felt that familiar mix of fear and thrill that always came when I was about to do something reckless. The fence sagged in places, and near the far corner I found a spot where others before me had cut the chain link, leaving a gap just wide enough to squeeze through. My heart pounded as I ducked inside, the sound of the forest muffling behind me, and suddenly I was standing on cracked pavement that had once been a driveway, weeds pushing through the asphalt, the asylum looming above me. The building was enormous, 3 stories of brick with wings stretching out like skeletal arms, the roof sagging in places, and though the windows were broken or boarded, I swore I saw faint movement behind one, a curtain twitching where there should have been nothing. I told myself it was just my nerves, adjusted my grip on the flashlight, and pushed the front doors open. They groaned like a dying animal, the sound echoing down the empty halls, and I stepped into the asylum's heart. The air inside the asylum hit me like a wall, stale and thick with the smell of mold, rust, and something faintly chemical that burned the back of my throat, and my flashlight beam cut through swirling dust motes, as if the building itself were exhaling after decades of silence. The entrance hall was cavernous, the tiles cracked and buckled, paint peeling from the high ceiling in curling strips that dangled like rotten flesh, and though everything was silent, the quiet was so total that it seemed alive, pressing in on my ears until even the faint scuff of my shoes sounded like gunshots. I moved slowly, sweeping the beam across the walls where faded murals of cheerful nurses and patients had been half scratched away, their eyes gouged out with something sharp, and I couldn't help but feel as if someone had done it not years ago but recently, as if the gouges were fresh wounds still bleeding. I told myself I'd only explore the ground floor, maybe peek upstairs if I had the guts. But almost immediately I noticed a pattern I couldn't ignore, faint footprints in the dust, too clear to be decades old, some small like a child's, others large and heavy, trailing deeper into the building. My skin prickled as I followed them down a corridor lined with offices, the doors hanging loose on rusted hinges, papers scattered across the floor like autumn leaves, many of them water-stained but some crisp, as though they'd been placed there yesterday. I crouched and picked one up. It was a patient record, the name smudged, the diagnosis circled in red. Acute psychosis with violent tendencies. I dropped it quickly, my fingers trembling, because I swore for a second I felt heat radiating from the page, like the anger of whoever it once described still burned there. I pressed on, the hallway bending sharply until it spilled into what must have been the recreation room, wide open with broken furniture piled against the walls and long dead vines creeping in through shattered windows. In the center of the room sat a single wheelchair, upright and facing me, though there was no reason it should have been there, no tracks in the dust leading to it. My breath caught and I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand, waiting for it to move, for something to rise out of it, but after what felt like an eternity nothing happened. I forced myself to step around it, my pulse hammering in my ears, but as I passed, the wheel gave the faintest creak, just once, and I bolted for the far doorway before my courage collapsed entirely. The corridors beyond grew darker, my flashlight flickering as if strained, and I began to notice strange details, scratches along the walls at shoulder height, some deep enough to cut through plaster to brick, and dark stains on the floor that looked too much like dried blood pooled in irregular shapes. The further I went, the colder it became, my breath fogging, and though I hadn't seen another living soul, I couldn't shake the certainty that I was not alone. Every now and then I'd catch movement at the edge of my light, a shadow darting across the hall or slipping into a room, and though I told myself it was tricks of the eye, when I stopped suddenly I heard it too, footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate, matching my own pace until I spun around, flashlight raised, only to find the hall empty. My nerves frayed, I thought of leaving, but when I retraced my steps, I swore the halls had shifted, the angles wrong, the doors unfamiliar, as though the asylum itself was rearranging to keep me inside. Panic gnawed at me, but some deeper compulsion kept dragging me forward, until I reached the stairwell leading down, not up, and though I had promised myself I wouldn't descend into the basement, the door was already open, yawning black like a throat waiting to swallow me. And the strangest part was that I could hear something down there, faint but unmistakable, a lullaby, hummed in a woman's voice, sweet and soft but twisted with dissonant notes that set my teeth on edge, echoing up the stairwell to curl around my ears like smoke. I should have run. I should have fled back through the fence and never looked back. But I tightened my grip on the flashlight, took a trembling breath, and began my descent into the dark below. The stairwell groaned under my weight as I descended, each step coated in dust and grit that crunched beneath my shoes, and the deeper I went the colder it became, as though the warmth of the world above had been cut off, leaving only a damp chill that seeped into my bones. The humming grew louder, winding around the concrete walls, a lullaby that sounded almost familiar but warped in such a way that the notes clawed at my nerves, and though I tried to tell myself it was wind or water pipes, I knew it wasn't, because the tune shifted when I stopped, as if aware of me, as if it were waiting for me to follow. My flashlight flickered as I reached the bottom, the beam cutting across a long hallway lined with metal doors, each with small barred windows, and it hit me then. This had been the solitary ward, the basement cells where the most unstable patients were locked away. My stomach tightened as I swept the light across door after door, seeing the rusted locks still in place, the paint chipped by countless scratches, deep gouges where fingernails or something sharper had scraped endlessly at the steel. I moved slowly, hard hammering, until I came to one door slightly ajar, the chain hanging loose as though it had been unlocked recently, and the humming came from within. Against every shred of reason, I pushed the door open, the hinges screaming, and raised the light. The cell was small, barely big enough for a cot, but there was no cot, only the outline of one on the floor where dust hadn't settled, as if it had been dragged out not long ago, and in the corner sat a figure. My breath caught, the silhouette of a woman in a hospital gown, her hair long and matted, her head bowed as she rocked slowly back and forth, humming that cursed lullaby. My voice cracked when I forced words out. "Hello? Are you real?" But she didn't respond, didn't even flinch at the sound of me, and when I stepped closer, flashlight trembling, she lifted her head just enough that I saw her face, or what remained of it. The skin was pale, stretched too tight over bone, her eyes black voids that seemed to swallow the light, and when she opened her mouth, the lullaby poured out louder, not sung but shrieked, the notes jagged and piercing until my knees buckled. I dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly across the floor, and in that broken light I saw her rise, impossibly tall, her limbs jerking like a puppet cut from its strings, and though I scrambled for the door, something invisible slammed it shut, the sound reverberating through the hall. The cell stank of rotten now, of iron and old blood, and as I clawed at the handle, the lullaby ceased, leaving only silence broken by the sound of breathing, her breathing, deep and ragged right behind me. I spun, pressing myself to the door, and the light from the fallen flashlight rolled to catch her feet, bare and bloody, hovering inches above the ground. My scream lodged in my throat, and I snatched the flashlight, swinging it up, but the cell was empty. Just dust, shadows, and the faint imprint of bare feet in the corner where she had sat. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping, slamming the cell door shut behind me, but when I looked down the hall I realized the other doors were no longer closed. Every one of them hung open now, the cells yawning black, and faint shapes stirred within, shifting at the edge of sight, waiting. Panic surged and I bolted, sprinting down the hallway. But the asylum wasn't letting me go so easily. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, doors multiplying, shadows reaching for me with every step, until finally I crashed into a stairwell I didn't remember seeing before, collapsing against the rail, my chest burning. I forced myself up, dragging my body up the steps two at a time. But halfway the humming started again, this time not one voice but many. A chorus echoing through the walls, filling the stairwell with sound until it felt like the building itself was singing. I stumbled into the first door I found, slamming it shut behind me, and leaned against the wall, shaking uncontrollably. The room was dark, empty save for overturned chairs and a broken gurney, but I wasn't safe. I knew that now. Whatever was in this asylum wasn't bound to the basement. It was everywhere, awake now, aware of me. And for the first time I wondered if I had crossed a line I couldn't come back from, if by stepping inside this place I had already traded something I couldn't ever reclaim. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight, my breathing ragged as if the very air of the asylum poisoned me, seeping into my lungs and clinging there. The room I had stumbled into was quiet, too quiet, like the silence that follows just after someone whispers your name, and as I swept the light around, I saw words etched into the walls, scratched with fingernails until blood had stained the paint. Over and over, the same phrase appeared. We never left. And beneath it crude drawings of faces, screaming faces, so many they overlapped, crowding one another, as though desperate to escape the wall itself. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I backed toward the door, but when my hand touched the handle, it burned hot, searing my skin as though the metal had just been pulled from fire. I yanked back with a cry, and at that moment, the light flickered again, plunging the room into near darkness, and I realized the chairs and gurney had shifted. They weren't overturned anymore. They were upright, positioned in neat rows facing the far wall, as if waiting for a performance. A chill clawed down my spine as I slowly turned, and what I saw rooted me to the floor. The faces scratched into the wall were no longer still. They moved, mouths opening in silent screams, eyes rolling as if they were alive but trapped within the paint, their lips forming words I couldn't hear but felt deep in my chest, a vibration that threatened to rip my sanity apart. I staggered back, slamming into one of the chairs, and the sound echoed like a gunshot. That's when the humming began again, not from the walls or the halls but from within my own head, growing louder until it drowned out thought, until my vision blurred and I dropped to my knees clutching my skull. Then, through the haze, I saw them, the patients, dozens of them, crowding the room though the door had never opened, their forms half-rotted, hospital gowns stained with filth and blood, their eyes black voids like the woman in the cell. They didn't speak, they only stared at me, swaying as if caught in some unseen current, and one by one they raised their hands and pointed. Not at me, but past me. I forced myself to turn, and in the beam of my failing flashlight I saw the gurney had changed. A body lay upon it, covered in a sheet, and though every cell in me screamed not to, I reached trembling fingers and pulled the fabric back. My stomach dropped. It was me. My own lifeless face stared back, pale and sunken, lips blue, eyes clouded with death. The flashlight died completely then, plunging me into blackness, and in that dark the voices finally spoke in unison, a whisper that slithered into my ear and curled around my heart. You were always ours. The room collapsed in sound, screams, laughter, the clang of metal doors, the creak of beds, until I couldn't separate them from my own voice as I screamed too. But it wasn't fear anymore, it was something else, something breaking inside me, something giving way. When the noise stopped, I was standing again, but the room was empty, the chairs overturned, the walls bare. My flashlight clicked back to life though I hadn't touched it, and when I raised it, I was no longer in the room. I was back in the main hall, standing before the front doors of the asylum. They were wide open now, moonlight spilling in, inviting me to leave. My heart leapt. I staggered forward, desperate for escape, but as I crossed the threshold I felt it, the weight pressing on me, the invisible chain. Outside, the night air was sharp and cool, the car still sat where I had left it, and yet something was wrong. The world looked distant, muted, as though a glass wall separated me from it. I rushed to the car, flung the door open, but my reflection in the window made me stop cold. It wasn't me anymore. The eyes were black voids, the skin stretched and wrong, the mouth curled in a grin that wasn't mine. My hand trembled as I reached for the reflection, and when my fingers touched the glass, the reflection didn't mirror me, it moved on its own, pressing its palm against mine. Behind me, the asylum groaned, the hum rising again, and I realized the truth I had been running from since the basement. I hadn't escaped. I never would. The patients weren't trapped in the asylum. I was. I had joined them the moment I walked inside, another soul swallowed by the hunger of this place, doomed to haunt its halls, waiting for the next curious fool who thought they could uncover forgotten horrors without becoming part of them. The last thing I heard before the night folded over me was that lullaby, soft now, almost tender, as if the asylum itself was welcoming me home. There is another place that becomes hell. I was 28 when I visited the abandoned city of Ravenshade, a place most people in Michigan only spoke of in whispers, a ghost town erased from maps, its history more rumor than fact, and yet its legend pulled me in like a moth to a flame because for years I had been chasing stories of places where reality bent under the weight of tragedy. I had read about it in a forgotten forum thread, a town that supposedly emptied overnight in the late 1970s after a series of accidents, fires, and unexplained disappearances, leaving behind homes with plates still set on the tables, clothes left hanging in closets, even cars with keys in the ignition, as though the people had simply vanished in the middle of living. The government never gave an official explanation, some blamed toxic chemicals, others whispered about a curse, and the skeptics dismissed it as urban legend, but I needed to see it for myself. Driving there was surreal. The roads narrowed the closer I got, pavement cracking into gravel, then dirt, then nothing but tracks half swallowed by weeds, and the forest closed in on both sides until I felt like I was leaving the world behind. My GPS failed miles before I reached what I thought was the outskirts, the signal fading to nothing, my phone showing only a blinking, searching icon that seemed like it was mocking me, and the air itself seemed heavier, thicker, like I had crossed an invisible barrier. The first sign of the city was a rusted welcome sign tipped sideways in the brush, its letters faint but still readable. Welcome to Ravenshade. Half covered in moss, bullet holes punched through the metal. I stopped the car and stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of the place already pressing against my chest, and then I drove forward slowly, tires crunching over broken asphalt. The city emerged like a corpse uncovered from the dirt, rows of houses with shattered windows, shops with faded signs, lampposts leaning at odd angles, and an eerie silence that made even the chirping of birds vanish. My first steps out of the car felt like trespassing into something sacred and poisoned, my boots crunching glass as I walked down the main street where a diner still stood, its front door ajar, the smell of rust and mold spilling out. I peeked inside and froze. The booths were still set with cracked vinyl cushions, plates with faded food scraps sat untouched, silverware scattered as if people had been mid-bite when they left, and the clock on the wall ticked once, even though the hands never moved again. A chill crawled up my spine, and I whispered aloud just to break the silence, but my own voice sounded wrong, too loud, like it didn't belong here. I explored further, finding a barbershop with scissors lying open on the counter, a grocery store with cans still stacked in neat rows, their labels faded but intact, and every building told the same story, life interrupted, frozen in place, abandoned in haste. Yet the deeper I went, the more I noticed things that didn't fit, footprints in the dust too fresh to be decades old, curtains shifting in windows where no wind blew, and shadows that seemed to linger a second too long after I turned my head. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself other explorers had been here, maybe squatters, maybe pranksters, but a part of me already knew I was lying to myself. Because when I entered the old schoolhouse at the edge of town, the air grew colder instantly, my breath puffing in front of me, and in the middle of the classroom was a chalkboard still scrawled with a lesson plan, but the words had changed. Instead of math problems and sentences, a single phrase stretched across the board, jagged and uneven, "We are still here." My heart thudded in my ears and I stumbled back, my flashlight beam quivering across rows of empty desks, and I heard something then, faint laughter, the kind of high-pitched giggles children make on playgrounds, but warped, hollow, echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. I called out instinctively, though I don't know why, maybe to prove I wasn't alone, maybe to confront whatever was playing tricks on me, but the laughter stopped instantly, cut off mid-breath, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I left quickly, but as I stepped outside, the town no longer looked the same. The fog had rolled in thick, blanketing the streets, obscuring buildings, and my car, my only escape, was nowhere to be seen, even though I had parked it right there on Main Street. The fog was so thick it felt alive, curling around me in heavy tendrils that clung to my skin, muffling sound, swallowing up the outlines of the buildings until the world seemed reduced to vague shapes and the wet crunch of my footsteps, and panic gnawed at my chest as I realized my car, my one way out, had simply vanished. I retraced my steps, circling the diner, the barbershop, the cracked main street, but all I found were shadows shifting at the edges of the fog, too tall and too fast to be tricks of the light, and each time I stopped to listen, I could hear something faint behind me, footsteps that stopped when I stopped, breathing that wasn't mine. My flashlight flickered like it was running out of power, though I had replaced the batteries just the day before, and I thought for a moment about yelling, calling out for anyone who might still be here. But something deep inside me resisted, some primal instinct warning me that if I acknowledged the presence in the fog, it would acknowledge me back. I pushed forward, deeper into the town, hoping to find some landmark that might help me reorient myself, and the fog broke just enough for me to see the outline of a church at the end of the street. Its steeple cracked but still jutting upward like a skeletal finger. Churches had always seemed safe in stories, sanctuaries against evil, so I went toward it, my boots scraping across the uneven asphalt, but the closer I got, the more wrong it felt. The stained glass windows were shattered, the heavy wooden doors hung open, and as I crossed the threshold, the silence hit me harder than the cold. The pews were splintered, some overturned, others perfectly aligned, and at the altar was a Bible, its pages damp and curling, open to a verse I didn't recognize, the words written not in neat print but in frantic scrawls, ink smeared like someone had rewritten it again and again in desperation. Above the altar, the cross was still there, but the figure nailed to it wasn't Christ. It was a mannequin, dressed in a hospital gown, its mouth stretched wide with a scream that no human throat could make, and I staggered back, bow rising in my throat, certain I had stepped into something more than just decay. Then came the whisper, soft at first, like someone leaning close to my ear though the pews around me were empty, a single word drawn out until it rattled in my bones. "Stay." I spun, flashlight beams slicing across the room, and for a fraction of a second I saw them, the pews filled with people, pale, expressionless, their eyes black voids that reflected the beam like animal eyes in the dark, and then the light sputtered and they were gone, leaving only overturned wood and shadows. My knees went weak, but I forced myself out of the church, gasping in the fog as if the air outside was cleaner, and I broke into a run without direction, just needing distance, needing space. But the city seemed endless now, street after street appearing where I was sure there had been only forests before, rows of houses identical, each with doors ajar. Windows glowing faintly though no electricity should have flowed through this place for decades. I slowed when I saw movement in one of those windows, the curtain shifting, and against my better judgment I stepped closer to peer inside. What I saw turned my stomach. Inside the living room sat a family of 4, a man, a woman, 2 children, all seated at the table with food laid out before them, but their heads were bowed unnaturally low, bent almost to the table's surface, and their arms twitched in jerks like broken marionettes, forks rising and falling without ever touching their mouths, as though trapped in some endless, grotesque routine. I stumbled back and the father's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine through the glass, and though his mouth never moved, I heard his voice clear as day, echoing inside my skull. "You shouldn't have come!" I ran again, heart clawing against my ribs, and every street I turned down seemed to lead me deeper, houses warping, signs shifting, until I couldn't tell if I was lost in the city or if the city itself was shifting around me to keep me trapped. Finally, I reached what looked like the city hall, its columns cracked, steps crumbling, but still grand in its decay, and I thought maybe inside I'd find records, answers, something that would explain how an entire town could vanish and leave only this nightmare behind. But as I stepped through the broken doors, the air grew suffocatingly hot, the walls bending inward like the building itself was breathing, and from somewhere in the vast empty lobby came the sound of dozens of voices whispering in unison, rising and falling like the tide, not words I could understand but something older, something that made my vision blur at the edges. I should have turned back then, but I couldn't, because I felt pulled forward, as though the city had decided I wasn't just a visitor anymore. I was becoming part of its story. The voices in the city hall swelled until they seemed to shake the air, dozens layered into hundreds, echoing from the walls, the ceiling, maybe even from beneath the floor itself, and I stumbled across the cracked marble tiles toward a reception desk where scattered papers lay yellowed with age. My flashlight beam swept across them and I froze, because they weren't all decades old. Some were crisp, unwrinkled, the ink fresh, as though someone had typed them yesterday. Lists of names with red marks through each one, names I didn't recognize until I reached the bottom of one page and saw my own, written in jagged black letters with a line drawn cleanly through it. My throat tightened, my skin crawling as though unseen fingers traced across my shoulders, and I shoved the papers away, my flashlight trembling. I told myself I had to find proof, something real I could take back, but deeper inside the hall, the whispers grew sharper, forming words, fragments of conversations that didn't belong to me but wormed their way into my head, pleas for help, screams cut short, prayers half finished, all overlapping until I thought I might go mad. At the far end of the lobby stood a pair of massive double doors, their handles rusted but strangely warm to the touch when I pushed them open, and beyond was a vast council chamber, chairs arranged in a circle, every seat occupied. For one suspended heartbeat I believed I had found the people of Ravenshade, but as my flashlight swept the room, I saw them for what they were, figures slumped in suits and dresses, their flesh desiccated yet unnervingly preserved, eye sockets hollow, mouths stretched open as if caught in silent debate, and still their heads turned in unison toward me, vertebrae cracking like breaking twigs. The air reeked of dust and rot, but underneath it I caught something else, faint but real, the smell of smoke, acrid and chemical, like a fire still burning somewhere unseen, and my mind flickered with the half-remembered rumors I'd read, that Ravenshade had died not from disease or disaster but from something it had done to itself. I staggered back from the circle, the flashlight jerking wildly, and the beam landed on a chalkboard propped against the wall, the words scrawled in jagged white. They burned USTO keep US quiet. The sound that tore from my throat barely resembled my own voice, but before I could run, one of the seated corpses shifted, its brittle hand twitching against the armrest, and then another's jaw creaked open, a hiss escaping like steam, until the entire circle rose from their seats in jerky, unnatural motions, their eyeless sockets all locked onto me. I bolted from the chamber, the doors slamming behind me though I never touched it, the voices shrieking now, not whispers but screams layered so thick they felt like they could split my skull, and in my blind panic I tore through a side hall and burst into what must have been the archives. Rows of filing cabinets loomed, many toppled, papers spilling like entrails across the floor, but in the center stood a single wooden chair, upright, with a journal resting on its seat. Against every instinct, I picked it up, flipping through pages filled with hurried handwriting, and pieced together the fragments, entries from a doctor named Halverson, who described how the city had been built on land that was never meant to be disturbed, how beneath the foundations lay something ancient, and when people began vanishing and voices filled the night, the city council met in secret, convincing themselves that sacrifice would save them. They chose families at random, burned them alive in their homes, and erased every record to cover it. But instead of cleansing the city, the act poisoned it, binding the dead to the streets, trapping their anger in brick and bone. My blood turned to ice as the final entry described their plan to erase everything, to burn the entire city in one night, and if necessary, themselves with it. And the last words scrawled across the page shook as though written by a trembling hand. We cannot leave. The city will hold US forever. I dropped the journal, my hands slick with sweat, and the room suddenly felt suffocating, the air alive with movement. Filing cabinets rattled, drawers yanked open one by one, papers swirling like a storm, and then something grabbed my arm, not with flesh but with a force like iron bands clamping down, invisible yet solid. I screamed and wrenched free, leaving a bruise already blooming across my skin, and I fled, bursting back into the night air. The fog had thickened into a wall, the streets warped like a maze. But in the distance I thought I saw light flickering, firelight maybe, and I ran toward it, desperate for some sign of life, some escape, even as the whispers rose into a chorus that seemed to chant my name with every step I took. The firelight I had glimpsed through the fog grew stronger as I stumbled closer, my lungs burning, my legs heavy as if the air itself wanted to hold me back. And when I finally emerged into the town square, my heart almost stopped because the entire space was ablaze, but nothing burned. The flames danced across the cobblestones, licking at the facades of buildings, curling over the skeletal remains of cars. Yet the wood and stone remained intact, untouched, and within that impossible inferno, shapes moved, men, women, children, all glowing faintly as though carved from embers, their faces twisted in agony yet frozen, repeating the same motions like actors in a play that never ended. They screamed without sound, clutched invisible children, clawed at doors that weren't there, and some turned their faces to me, mouths wide as if to warn me or curse me. I couldn't tell, and the moment I stepped forward the fire surged higher, the figures closing in, their arms stretching toward me, their fingers passing through air yet searing my skin like hot brands. I reeled back, clutching my arm, but the brand mark remained, a perfect circle scorched into my flesh, and for a moment I swore I heard their voices inside my head, whispering the same sentence over and over, "You cannot leave." I spun around to run, but the street I had come down was gone, the fog knitting itself into a solid wall, and behind it I heard the crackling of laughter, deep, guttural, not the voices of victims but something older, something that had been here before the city and would remain after it was gone. I backed away, the fire still surrounding me, until I tripped over something hard and fell, my flashlight clattering across the stone, its beam landing on a half-collapsed statue at the edge of the square, a monument I hadn't noticed before. It was carved from blackened stone, worn and pitted, and though the features were eroded, the outline remained, arms outstretched, a face tilted toward the sky, its mouth open in a perpetual scream, and beneath it an inscription barely legible, "We offered and still it takes." My mind reeled, connecting the fragments of the journal, the whispers, the endless replay of suffering, and I understood, maybe too late, that Raven Shade wasn't haunted in the way people imagined. It wasn't the dead clinging to the living, it was the land itself, some ancient hunger that had demanded sacrifice, and the city's founders had tried to appease it with blood and fire but only chained themselves here forever. A wind rose around me, hot and suffocating, carrying ash that wasn't really ash but fragments of faces, eyes, mouths, screaming, and I dropped to my knees, covering my head, feeling the square tilt beneath me as though the ground itself breathed. I don't remember standing, only running through streets that bent and shifted, buildings collapsing and rebuilding as if the city was alive, until I found myself at the edge of town again, the same broken sign half swallowed by weeds, the same cracked asphalt road leading away, and behind me the city smoldered like a living furnace. I staggered into the dark, half expecting the fog to drag me back, but this time it didn't, and after what felt like hours I collapsed on the side of the highway, the sun bleeding weakly over the horizon, painting the world in color again. When I finally made it back to civilization, no one believed me. They said Raven Shade was a ghost story, a name whispered by truckers to spook kids, no record of it on maps, no proof it had ever existed. And when I tried to show the brand burned into my arm, it was gone, the skin smooth as if it had never been touched. And yet, some nights, when I close my eyes, I smell smoke, acrid and chemical, and hear voices overlapping in my skull, calling me back, reminding me that I left something unfinished, and worse, reminding me that the city never lets anyone truly leave. Sometimes, driving along highways at night, I see the fog on the horizon, thicker than weather, pulsing faintly orange with firelight, and I know Raven Shade is still there, waiting, hungering, and sooner or later, it will call me home for good.